Namaskar, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha. You're watching Perspective. Well, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will be presenting the Union Budget 2022-23 in just a couple of days from now. Like every year, there are a lot of expectations as different sectors, people from all walks of life, pin their hopes on what the government's announcements will be. Considering factors like the ongoing third wave of the pandemic, the economy still recovering from the pandemic shock, inflation at an all-time high, and the challenge to boost consumption, what will be the finance minister's key priorities? Which sectors are likely to be in focus this time around? And will there be something for the middle class? We'll try and find answers to these and also related aspects on the upcoming budget with an eminent panel of experts who are joining me on the program. I'm pleased to welcome on this edition of Perspective, Ms. Deepshikha Sikarwar. She's Senior Editor, Economic Times. Monika, Halan, author and adjunct professor, National Institute of Securities Markets. And Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee, consulting editor, The Business Standard. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on Sansad TV. Mr. Bhattacharjee, allow me to begin the program today with you. Your thoughts on how crucial this budget is going to be, given the fact that we're still amidst the pandemic and an ongoing third wave, which fortunately has not been as devastating as the previous ones, but nevertheless has made some dent to the recovery, the economic recovery that we were witnessing earlier. So keeping all of these aspects in mind, how crucial is the budget going to be and what are going to be the priority areas for the finance minister?
Well, Tina, there are two parts to what you've asked. One is what is the priority area for the finance minister? The other part is how crucial. The crucial part, let me handle quickly. See, for this government, and it's has rightly done so, they have disengaged budget largely from policy making in response to issues, which is as it should be. Budget of the government for the last few years has basically been a honest appraisal of the accounts of the country. This is actually very important, but it is a long-term thing which the government has been doing. For instance, to put it into context, last year, something which people have already forgotten and are not commenting on anymore, is that the government presented a very transparent set of data on what is its real expenditure. Now, these sort of expenditure patterns do not excite the markets in that way. It may not also make for very good headline news, but they're extremely important for assessing the health of the economy. So the budget papers, the budget numbers that would be coming out on 1st February, the one very important metric on which I would want to judge it, and I'm sure it'll surprise us on the positive side, is the transparency of the numbers about how the government expenditure receipts are placed. And this is therefore very significant in that way, because once those are cleared and made absolutely, that what's the lay of the land, you can then start to decide what is the policies. Because the policies can happen throughout the year. For instance, we are just finishing with the third wave. Now, let's just assume that some devastating fourth wave is happening. Would the budget be able to deal with it? No. But if the budget keeps the numbers ready and clear, then the government is in communication with the people about where it stands and what is the possibilities going in it. So that way, the budget, that is where I would like to keep the budget. About the priorities, we can discuss later on about what would be the finance minister's priorities, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. But this is a very important priority, and on which I must give the government kudos that it has actually cleaned up the budget numbers drastically over the years.
Sure.
And that is where a significant analysis, significant part of policy making becomes grounded in facts rather than in fiction. Yes, Lee.
Okay, so we'll have a detailed discussion on sector-wise expectations a little later on the program. But Deepshikha, Sikarwar, coming to you, a lot of analysts in the run-up to the budget have said this is going to be an election budget in view of elections to 5 states. Now, given the situation we are in, last time around, it was the first budget that came after the devastation caused by the pandemic, and the focus clearly was on infrastructure. Now, this time, keeping in view also the elections in mind, how do you think the government is going to strike that right balance between politics and the economy?
Tina, if you've seen in the past, this budget is a continuation. It would be seen as continuation of measures that the government has been taking to, lift growth, to lift consumption so far, because we were hit by a very bad pandemic, which really dented our economy. So while there are state elections, we've seen in the past that the government's not really gone all out, with a lot of populism, doling out freebies or doling out measures in the budget. So I really don't see that, this year, this budget would be any different. And in terms of the priorities for the government, they haven't really changed. You have to take measures which will support growth. You have to take measures which will support growth without sort of fueling up inflation, which has become a big concern.
Absolutely.
You have to look at the fiscal deficit also, because you will need to continue with spending without really, stoking inflation. So all these priorities, if you take into account, there is little room left for populism. So while they will continue with the food program because that is required, it cannot be seen as something which is being done for election, because we are still in middle of a pandemic, maybe not as severe as it was earlier. So in terms of populism, I think maybe a very few token measures in terms of maybe some stops on income tax for individuals or something, but any large scale populism, I doubt that's likely to come about.
Okay, I'll take the question on the expectation of the tax front, because the middle class, of course, has very, very high hopes. Monika, Halan, I'll take that question in the later half, but coming to the consumption part first, because that still remains the biggest challenge. Our recovery has so far been robust. The future outlook looks good. But I think apart from inflation, one of the biggest challenges is on the consumption front. What measures do you see the finance minister henceforth taking in her upcoming budget and beyond to actually address this part, to give more money to people to spend and, increase consumption?
Important point on that consumption, but I'll just add to what Deepshikha said about this budget being an election budget. I'm hearing this all around, and I'm just asking the question, how are you going to benefit people of 5 states through the union budget? So this entire communication on this budget being an election budget is just political. We should just park it aside. They can't use the union budget to benefit people only of 5 states. And you don't have that kind of money to benefit all the people in the way which would get you the election vote. So this is just political rhetoric. But coming to your consumption point, and that is I'm looking at this as a budget that should boost consumption. What the pandemic has done is that people who had capital, who had savings, who had money either in the stock market or somewhere, parked aside, they have done well. Their wealth has grown. There is data to prove that people at the bottom half, the last 2 quartiles, have suffered very badly. So people who had savings, small savings, they've got wiped out. And the rest of the people have seen really loss of incomes, jobs. So then you need to use the budget to boost consumption, because unless consumption comes back, you are not going to get the baton being handed from the government infrastructure spending to the private sector for their round of private investment to begin. So this is a crucial part of trying to give money to the people. Then we come across the problem of the fact that very few Indians like to pay income tax. A country of 1.3 billion, I think the data is 15 million people pay taxes. Less than 7% of that pay more than 1.5 lakh in taxes. So then we come to this problem. Okay, if you were to try and reduce taxes, It's a very small part of the population. But let's stay with this and say, what is it that the government can do, what budget can do to help people who are part of this small elite organized sector employees who have no option but to pay taxes, right? And this is, we're trying to boost consumption for this group of people. Very, very difficult to target through either lowering tax slabs or raising deductions, because even if you were to raise the ATC deduction, I'll have to save more to get that deduction, right? So I don't have the money, right? So one of the options, and this is something I said last year as well, and I will repeat it, is that there is this mandatory contribution called EPF. The employee's contribution is 12%, the employer gives 12%. It's a voluntary contribution over 15,000 rupees of income per month, but most organizations make it mandatory. Give a 1 year or a 2 year holiday to the employee of his own contribution. Let the company continue to give that 12% of basic, but the employee's contribution, give him, her an option not to contribute for 1 or 2 years. This is straight money in the pocket to spend. So I'm hoping that this time they've used some of these innovative things to try and give money, because you can't lower tax slabs anymore. You can take the highest marginal rate of taxation, 42.7, from the richest down a bit, but that doesn't put money in the hands of people. So yes, you need a consumption boost. They will have to find some way of putting money in the hands of people, and then it becomes a policy problem. How do you do the transfer? So I really hope they can use this EPFO tool to give some money to taxpayers who can then actually go out and spend.
Okay. Coming to other sectors, Mr. Bhattacharjee, obviously last time around infrastructure remained in the focus. Do you expect that to continue this time as well? And apart from infrastructure, which are the other sectors that you see emerging winners after the finance minister presents her budget?
Infrastructure, of course. I mean, given the national infrastructure pipeline, the asset monetization, that's no-brainer that infrastructure will continue to get a significant chunk. In fact, my estimate is that last year we were about 5.56 trillion. This should go up to something close to 7 trillion this time as infrastructure spend in the budget, which is absolutely necessary. We had a 26% growth in infrastructure spending last time. This year more. Remember one thing, that we often berate the government for not spending adequately on the money that is allocated for infrastructure. But this money, because it has to be going through certain procedures, it doesn't start flowing immediately. So there is a time lag between when the money is allocated and when the money starts getting spending. Usually it is about 7 to 8 months, which means that the benefits of that infrastructure spend that was allocated last year would be kicking in now. And that is where you'll be getting the benefit. So yes, if the government keeps on with this flow every year, then you definitely would be seeing a positive ripple effect coming along. Also, infrastructure spending, unlike what people believe, includes not just roads, ports, bridges, but there are lots of other sectors which have been included in the definition of infrastructure. Like even hotel construction also has come into infrastructure, and there's many others which have been included in the infrastructure packet. What does infrastructure spending do? It essentially creates constructional jobs. That's a very major thing. So infrastructure does both. It creates a spending and it creates the right type of spending, which helps the economy to start chugging. When you say which are the other sectors, what the government essentially would be looking at, and this is a critical sector that the government would be looking at this year, I'm absolutely sure, which is green energy or green spend.
Yes.
There's a lot that the government of India is already encouraging in terms of shift to EV, in terms of shifting to other climate appropriate behavior. All of these have good employment potential. All of these are also something which is both in medium and long term good for the economy. So I would expect the finance minister to be spending quite a bit of time talking about her priorities for the green sector, that is the entire range of environment-friendly policies. That's very significant. The health sector spending, remember, will be largely be on the here and now. There is expansion of the medical infrastructure, the hospital beds, the paying for the medicines that the people are needing, the allocation which will actually be needed for the national health mission and for building up the national health stack, the national digital mission.
Okay.
Both of these spendings last year, I mean, it didn't really flow through because there were lots of restrictions. Primarily because the government was building up its buffer for spending on the immediate crisis. So these would start spending. Having done all of these, the government then is left with very little money to spend on anything else. So I would think it's infrastructure, SOPs for the energy sector, the green environment sector, and additional spend for the health sector, would largely be the ones where you would see the finance minister spending.
Okay.
More than that will have to mean that cutting into something else. There's already a huge expenditure already there for drinking water mission.
Okay, Deepshikha, 3 sectors, expectations and the kind of hopes and what actually finance minister can do. It's a large chunk of the 3 sectors, but education, I think, going forward will also require focus. One sector that has borne the brunt of the pandemic, also adapted very quickly, we've seen, to the new normal, but to achieve new India, and wherein education will play a very, very important role, given if we want to reap the benefit of the demographic dividend, how important is the education sector and the need to actually give it the focus that it also requires in the budget?
Definitely, Tina. But, like health, education, also there is responsibility which also lies with the states. But we do expect that, education will be in focus in this budget, particularly because pandemic has changed the whole dynamics of education, especially with, children being, forced to stay at home and study through digital means. So we do expect finance minister to sort of, come out with some measures in this area, some kind of policy intervention which is required to ensure, quality of education, as also in terms of, how to support particularly the middle class and also the, the lower classes through, to ensure that the education of children doesn't get hampered because of the need for digital means. So while, large heavy lifting in this area needs to be done by the states, but center is likely to offer some helping hand in this. So in the education sector, there is expectation that there could be some measures on these lines. But largely this budget would, from what I understand, will focus on larger, broader, economic policy interventions, which are required right now in terms of, boosting growth through supporting investment, supporting consumption, and also to see, how these measures do not sort of flare up inflation.
Okay. Monika, Halan, so obviously, clearly the focus is on how to sustain the recovery that we have made so far, and also going forth in the next financial year and beyond, have stronger growth, of which the circumstances look very, very bright at the moment. But at the same time, the thrust should also be on research and development, on innovation, if we talk about becoming Atmanirbhar. If we compare ourselves to other countries, we are spending very, very less on R&D, somewhere around 0.06% as compared to other countries which spend about 2 to 3% of their GDP on R&D. What kind of measures are required, and is there scope in the budget to actually give more to the sector, spend more for the R&D sector?
Tina, at a time when you're trying to survive, you don't try and build a fancy boat. So yes, R&D is very important, and yes, we need to put money there. But it's 100 once in a 100-year event which has hit all of us, and you can't, nobody is really responsible as such. I think the entire effort right now is to just get by, just get everybody, not allow a single person to starve to death because of this, or not have the medical, to be able to access medical help when they need it. I think I would call it a survival budget. We just have to use the money to get through this time, to spend on things like food, health, and even education. I would park it behind something called skills development, and possibly use the money to help this missing middle. So people below poverty line, they access free food and they are eligible for the PMJ, the free 5 lakh health benefit. And the middle and the classes above that have some amount of money and savings to look after themselves. There's this missing middle, the unorganized sector. I think some money has to get allocated, and again, very difficult to find a way to access them. But there is this smart card, which a lot of the unorganized sector workers are accessing. And through that smart card, it's possible that there could be a plan to extend some of these benefits of maybe a lower price food, maybe a lower priced health insurance policy to them. Because this is really, you have millions of people at risk of slipping back into poverty because this is the missing middle. So I would tightly focus on preventing the slip back into poverty of this segment who have just about got out of this everyday meal struggle. I would imagine we should just go all out for that. R&D will happen.
Okay. Shubhamoy, also, one important aspect has been, even though the recovery has been good, it's been unequal. If we look at different sectors, so the sectors who are still lagging behind will require some kind of hand-holding. Can we expect that? Is there scope in the budget left after we've spoken about the huge chunk going to infrastructure, going towards clean energy, and if there's anything left for health and education? But going forward, what about these sectors who will have to, pulled into making an equal kind of recovery if we are to sustain growth in the longer run?
In this context, I fully take on board what Monika was saying about giving consumption, her innovative idea that let the EPF contribution of the employees be exempted for a couple of years. These are the sort of things that actually will be very useful. Remember, lots of people are getting into the formal sector, so that sort of an idea was very wonderful. Also, essentially, let's remember that along with center, it is the state's responsibility also to ensure to do the heavy lifting. What Deepshikha was pointing out, that the health and education budget of the states need to be adequately passed, is a very important point. Most states have become essentially pension-paying entities. States pay only pension other than the interest. That is something that state governments need to look at very carefully. Because that is where, when we are saying that we want to support people who are the marginal, who are the edge of subsistence, who are at the risk of slipping into poverty, as one was pointing out, you need that sort of an intervention by the states. There is a large, it's something that everybody has to come in. Whenever the government has said there's a freeze on wages of the government employees, you get a blowback. Small savings rates, if it's cut back, there's a blowback. And these are articulate people, articulate sections who can do it. But that is where we need to also be along with the government to say that we need to understand that this is what we need to be doing to help the people out. Otherwise, it's very difficult to expect that government as a neutral person, as a neutral entity, would be able to allocate among the competing ends. The poorest ends will be hit the hardest if this isn't adequately internalized, that others need to do the sacrifices. Okay. And I think that's significant here.
Okay, Deepshikha, one final question from you. Can we expect any kind of big ticket reforms from the budget in terms of sectors like banking, maybe in terms of privatization, etc.?
See, in terms of reforms, if you see, the government has been, announcing measures past over 2 years, we've seen measures being announced in between. So budgets essentially become sort of, just presenting an account of, what's happening, state of affairs, also, state of accounts, and just give a directional policy direction going forward. So there would be measures for various sectors. In banking, we've seen Bad Bank is now up and running. There've been measures in the banks in over the past few years. The whole balance sheet cleanup which has happened. So, but on asset monetization, privatization, I think that would get a huge thrust in the upcoming budget, because that is where the government will be able to get its money from, because that's the only option available right now. If you want to cut down on your borrowing to continue spending and without stoking in inflation. So it has to come from your asset monetization and privatization. So it should get its due in the upcoming budget, definitely.
Okay. So expectations abound, but what actually will be delivered in the upcoming budget, given the situation we are still in, given the limitations and constraints of the government, we'll have to wait and watch until the 1st of February. With that, I'll have to wrap up the discussion today. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. It was a pleasure having you on the show. So that's it from us on this edition of Perspective today. Thanks very much to all our viewers as well for their time.